Like it or not, mainstream gaming media wields enormous institutional power. Not just over what games you and I buy, but over investor sentiment. Capital looks to outlets like IGN for seemingly credible signals on how a gaming company's product is performing, whether a studio is worth backing, whether a creative direction is worth funding. That's not an opinion. That's what happened when Pearl Abyss's stock dropped over 40% in 5 days, despite selling 2 million copies in 24 hours. The reviews moved the money. And the reviews were written by people who didn't have the vocabulary to evaluate what they were even looking at. Because the framework they've been using, across game after game, year after year, studio after studio, was only ever built to understand one kind of game, one design philosophy, one cultural tradition. Applied to everything else, it doesn't criticize, it just rejects. And here's the irony that should make your blood boil. These are the same outlets that built their entire identity around diversity, that made diversity their brand, their moral authority, their reason to exist. But when two of the most genuinely diverse games ever made showed up, diverse not in the narrow political sense, but in the deepest possible sense, in design philosophy, in cultural foundation, in their fundamental vision of what games should be, they got the same score, the same language, the same dismissal, 4 months apart. A preference so embedded in a framework, it stopped feeling like a preference. A standard nobody ever voted on, applied with the institutional power to move stock prices and shape what gets made next. That's not criticism. That's a sickness. And Crimson Desert's excellence, its sales, its community sentiment, has torn the whole facade open. But before we get into that, I want to explain why Crimson Desert is particularly special to me. Picture this. There's a moment where you're just walking, a dirt path through a forest in spring, a stream somewhere to your left, wind through the canopy, wildflowers along the road, a medieval village in the distance, smoke rising, the faint sound of horses and daily life carrying across the valley. Leaves falling in that specific, lazy way that only happens when the wind is just right. A guard walks past without stopping, without a cutscene. Just a glance and 3 words under his breath.
Be somewhere else, you c***.
Nobody told you to come here. There is no waypoint, no objective. You came because you saw a path and wanted to know where it went. And somewhere in that small, quiet, completely unremarkable decision, you remembered why you fell in love with games in the first place. That feeling. The one most games stopped trying to give you years ago. The one that made you stay up past midnight as a kid. Crimson Desert gave it back. And it's the feeling that game journalists gave us 6. Dragon Age Veilguard, a game that became a cultural punchline almost immediately after launch, that gamers almost universally rejected as hollow and creatively bankrupt. IGN gave it a 9. Assassin's Creed Shadows, the latest entry in a franchise that has been running on autopilot for years, comfortable, familiar, asking nothing new of the player or the medium. IGN gave it an 8. The Outer Worlds 2, a competent Western RPG that does exactly what Western RPGs have always done, no more, no less. IGN gave it an 8. Now here is where wins meet. A game that did something nobody in game development had the courage to attempt, since Guild Wars 2 tried to innovate the MMO formula back in 2012. A game that looked at 20 years of stagnation and broke the entire formula, cutting unconditional scale to unlock combat physics and world immersion and wuxia depth that no recent online game has ever come close to. Built on Chinese political philosophy and 1,000 years of literary tradition and a genuinely revolutionary design hypothesis. IGN gave it a 6. And here is Crimson Desert, a Korean studio's decade-long obsession with what open-world gaming can actually be, with combat depth and visual ambition and sandbox freedom that no established studio has had the courage to attempt in recent years. 2 million copies sold in 24 hours. IGN gave it a 6. Reviewed by the same person who gave The Outer Worlds 2 an 8. The 3 Western games, sitting at 8s and 9s, all share something. They are comfortable. They are familiar. They fit inside a critical framework built around a very specific vision of what games should be. Narrative-driven, accessible, story first, world second. And the 2 games that came from completely different cultural foundations, built on completely different philosophies of what games should ask of you, they both got the same score, 4 months apart, almost word for word in the same language. IGN on Where Winds Meet. The attempt to shove many different kinds of experiences into one game only ensures that none of these elements reach their full potential. IGN on Crimson Desert 4 months later. A jack of all trades, but a master of none. That's almost word for word the same conclusion, stamped onto 2 completely different games from 2 completely different cultures. And it keeps going. Where Winds Meet gets penalized for having too much depth in its systems. Crimson Desert gets penalized for having controls that ask too much of you. Neither reviewer stopped to ask whether that depth serves the design, whether there's a philosophy or a tradition sitting behind those systems that might be worth understanding before marking it down. Where Winds Meet is called an ambitious exercise in maximalism. Crimson Desert is an extremely ambitious open-world adventure. Both times, ambition is a warning. When Rockstar is ambitious, they become cultural institutions. When an Eastern studio is ambitious, they get told to simplify. And then the boss fights. This one almost made me laugh. Where Winds Meet's bosses are criticized for being too similar to regular enemies, while Crimson Desert's bosses are criticized for being too different from the rest of the game. One too similar, one too different. Same score. The conclusion was written before the game was played. The framework doesn't ask, what is this game trying to do? It asks, does this game match what I already understand? And when the answer is no, it has always been a 6. IGN published their Crimson Desert review on March 20th, and by March 23rd, 72 hours later, Pearl Abyss had already patched in keyboard shortcuts for basic menus, fixed the interaction UI, adjusted boss difficulty, added storage, and improved control responsiveness. The things that dominated the review were gone in 3 days. A review is supposed to evaluate the skeleton, the fundamental design philosophy, the combat depth, the world artistry, the ambition of what's being attempted, not the surface details that any competent studio patches away in the first week. And we're just supposed to be okay with that? We saw the exact same thing with Where Winds Meet. Reviews focused on friction points that patches addressed within weeks, while the things that actually define those games barely registered. Reviewers are supposed to understand greater context. They're supposed to know the difference between a launch window detail and a fundamental design failure. Instead, we get paragraphs about button mapping that were obsolete before the review was called. Who decided that story is the most important criterion in a game review? Who decided graphics don't matter? Because if your priority is visual beauty, if what you want is to exist inside something that looks and feels like a painting come to life, is there a single game released in the last 5 years more jaw-dropping than Crimson Desert? That preference, shared by millions of players, barely registers in these reviews. Story is the serious criterion. Graphics are a nice bonus. Controls are a deal-breaker. But who established that hierarchy? Because the millions of people who bought Crimson Desert on day one clearly operate by completely different priorities, and their money is as real as anyone else's opinion. In Crimson Desert, you'll get these side quests, and anyone who's played Black Desert Online will smile at this immediately, that are just pure grind. A location, some enemies, no preamble. I got sent to a quarry once. I went in at dead of night, torches burning, shadows everywhere, and somewhere in the middle of it, I stopped thinking about objectives and just felt it. The pure spectacle of the combat, the weight of every hit, the way the animations chain into each other like something choreographed by someone who genuinely loves this, wave after wave, and the satisfaction building with each one. When I walked out, it was already dawn. The light was coming over the hills, and I felt like I'd just single-handedly taken out an army, like the 300 at Thermopylae, like something out of a legend. That feeling doesn't come from a cutscene. Crimson Desert is ballsy enough to bring MMO grinding into a single-player game and trust that the combat is spectacular enough to carry it. Because it is. I've played thousands of hours of Cyberpunk 2077, with mods, without mods, every ending, every build, every piece of DLC. Sometimes in a 3-hour session, I'll spend more time watching cutscenes than actually playing. 15 minutes at a stretch, just sitting there watching Night City unfold. And I genuinely love that. Because Cyberpunk earned those cutscenes, and CD Projekt Red understood their game was a cinematic experience first, and an open world second. That conviction produced one of the greatest games ever made. Crimson Desert has a different conviction. At 30 hours in, I can tell you it doesn't have that same storytelling. And honestly, I don't think it's trying to. Because in Crimson Desert, you don't watch the story. You run through it. You stumble into it. You walk into a quarry at night and walk out at dawn feeling like a legend. And nobody scripted that moment for you. It just happened. Because the world is alive and the combat is extraordinary. And Pearl Abyss trusted you enough to find it yourself. And the fact that these outlets couldn't recognize that as a legitimate form of storytelling tells you everything about the limits of their framework. Like a teacher grading a painting on how well it reads as a poem, the framework was wrong for the subject. I still play MMOs to this day. I genuinely love grinding. There's something deeply satisfying about it that no cutscene has ever replicated for me. And clearly millions of people feel the same way. The question is whether the people with the institutional power to shape this industry actually believe that both kinds of games deserve to exist, or whether their version of diversity only goes as far as their own comfort zone. Some people called the last video right-wing propaganda, and that perfectly illustrates the problem. The moment you label a conversation about game design philosophy as political, you've replaced the argument with a category. It ends the conversation before it starts. So I'm not going to defend myself from it. The major irony of what game journalists keep doing is that in criticizing Crimson Desert and Where Winds Meet for not being the games they wanted them to be, they are actively killing the very diversity they claim to champion. Every time they apply the same narrow framework to a game that was never trying to fit it, they send a signal to the industry. Don't make games like this. Make games we already know how to evaluate. Make Veilguard, make Avowed, make Fable number 57. And if that signal goes unchallenged long enough, that's exactly what we'll get. These outlets were created to solve a real problem. Information failure in a market where consumers can't fully evaluate a product before buying it. A financial analyst has standards. A lawyer has standards. A doctor has standards. But a games reviewer at a legacy media outlet? One person, one set of preferences, no defined methodology, no accountability to the audience they claim to represent, deciding the score of a product thousands of people worked on for 8 years. And when that score moves stock prices and shapes what gets greenlit next, that's not criticism anymore. That's market chaos dressed up as market information. That's why it's on us to scrutinize, push back, and challenge these narratives. Because if we don't, nobody will. We need to be loud enough and specific enough and right enough, often enough, that the signal we're sending starts to compete with theirs. Because if we don't, the studios building something genuinely different will keep getting punished for it. And eventually, they'll stop trying. Crimson Desert gave back something I hadn't experienced in so long. That feeling of playing Skyrim past midnight on a school night, just wandering north, ignoring the main quest because the world was immersive enough that you didn't need a reason to keep going. Reading through the comments from the last video, there were a staggering number of people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, even 70s. And I keep thinking about what it means, that the generation who lived through the actual golden age of this medium, who remember when it was genuinely trying to do something new, are finding that feeling again in a game from a studio on the other side of the world that apparently didn't get the memo that this kind of ambition isn't worth the risk anymore. But before I go, a genuine thank you to Enjoy GM, who's been a long-time supporter of the channel. If you're playing Where Winds Meet, Wuthering Waves, Genshin Impact, or another gacha, guilty pleasures of mine as well, Enjoy GM lets you top up at better rates than you'd normally get. They operate across regional markets and pass those geographic price differences directly to you. No account login required, nothing sensitive shared, no complicated steps. You enter your UID, pick your amount, pay, done. 24/7 human support available if you need it. Link is in the description. And to everyone who watched, left a comment, sent a super thanks, or joined the membership, genuinely thank you. This channel exists outside of my day job, and every video takes real time and real resources. And the fact that you show up and support it the way you do means more than I can say. If you want to continue these conversations in real time, the community Discord link is in the description, alongside everything else. That's it from me for now. Until the next one.